Welcome to episode 11 of the vlog. As I mentioned in episode 10, we found an opportunity to take a short trip over to Vegas to play some poker. I also met up with some of the guys part of a poker texting group that I'm a member of, which was definitely an awesome experience. We had flown in from Los Angeles early in the day and ended up with accommodations at Bally's, which is conveniently located across the street from the Bellagio. Now that we've landed and settled in, we're headed over to the Bellagio for our first Vegas session. We had called in and put ourselves on the wait list, and upon arrival, we initially were sat down at the 1-3 game for about an hour while we waited for a 2-5 or a 5-10 seat to open up. The game was your typical 1-3 game, nothing really to mention, and honestly it was a pretty uneventful hour. Eventually, our name is called for a 2-5 seat, and not too surprisingly the table has a good mix of local grinders as well as several recreational players. About 10 minutes had passed since I sat down at the table, and the 2-5 game seemed mostly docile. The initial players at this table seemed to be playing fit or fold, and comprising of a lot of passive play mostly. No obvious loose cannons and no one really getting after it. In this first hand, we have an early position raise to 15 and action folds to the button who makes the call. And we have Queen 9 of the suited variety in the big blind. This is a pretty good hand to squeeze with, and I was pretty tempted to just start blasting away. But this just isn't the type of game to start doing that in. So we end up making the call instead, looking to play post-flop. The flop comes Queen 8-7 monotone, and action checks around. When the turn brings a 5 of clubs, we lead for 25 to see the original raiser fold, but the button call. The button here could be calling with an assortment of hands, including funky draws and possibly milling pairs. On the river 7, which pairs the board, I bet $45 looking to get value by an assortment of 8s and possibly some pocket pairs here. The button does not oblige and folds, and we pull in our first small pot. We find Ace-8 of hearts in a cutoff after 2 players in early position limp in. We can definitely afford to overlimp here in this game, and that's exactly what we end up doing. The big blind checks this option and we're off to see the flop 4 ways. The flop comes Ace-King-Deuce rainbow. The mid-position player doesn't lose a beat and bets out for 15 after the big blind and early position player checks to him. I call, and so does the early position limper. When the turn brings a 10 of diamonds, getting called by 2 people doesn't seem to slow down the mid-position player who bets out for 45 once it's checked to him. At this point, when we don't gain any additional equity, this becomes a pretty straightforward fold. So far, this session has been mostly small ball poker. And while we'd always love to get seated at a table with crazy action where people are shoving all in on top of each other and piling in stacks, that's just not a good representation of your typical Vegas 2-5 table in 2021. As an additional observation, for those who are planning to visit in the near future, I think it's a little odd to see the recent trend where the typical 2-5 opening size is 15. I think in prior visits, the lowest I've seen is 20 and typically 25. While a smaller raising size means we can begin to raise a larger subset of our overall range, I feel like staying balanced in your average 2-5 game is somewhat overrated. In this next hand, we have King 10 of clubs, and when there's 2 limpers to that low jack, he raises to 25 and I call here. This opponent was one of the few players at the table I wanted to get involved with. Action folds around, and this all of a sudden becomes a heads up pot. The flop comes King Queen 5, which is a great flop for my hand. And when the action checks to me, I have an option of betting out or checking through. I'm not going to go into the entire reasoning behind my decision to check here, but let's just say it's really good to have some top pairs in your check back range sometimes. The turn brings an offsuit 4, which is unlikely to really change much in this hand. When the opponent checks to me again, it looks like he's just given up on the pot, so I bet $25 and he ends up calling. The river brings the deuce of diamonds, and as Norman Chad says, since the dawn of time, the deuce on the river does not change anything anywhere, anytime, or anyhow. The opponent checks it over to me quickly, and I fire out for 85 and receive a quick fold. So far, action has been decent, as there are quite a few chasers and non-believers at the table, though no one has been paying off big bets here. So the game has been really about playing in position, and picking off small pots consistently. Normally, I consider looking for a better 2-5 game, but in this case I'm getting zero resistance from abusing the table dynamics, and more importantly, no one seems to be interested in playing back at me without a really strong hand. I kinda feel like I'm in a tournament right now, looking to chip up slowly. Another orbit goes by after hand number 4, and we pick up pocket 4s and not low jack. The person to my direct right decides to open for 20 after 1 limper. My call opens up an avalanche of callers here when the button, small blind, and early position limper calls. We're 5 ways to the flop of Ace Jack 8 Rainbow, and the action checks all the way around. We end up binking a set on the turn when the 4 of spades rolls off, and to compound the good news, the small blind now leads out for 30. This is typically some kind of top pair or better holding in this specific situation. Action folds to me, and this is a must raise situation, so we decided to raise this to 80. The small blind is leading out fairly weak relative to the size of the pot, so we know he has something here, yet we don't want to necessarily blow him off the hand with his relative bet sizing dictating the play. We want to get more value from this opponent given the strength of our hand, but yet we don't have a lot to protect against. So we offer a middling raise sizing, which doesn't appear to be too scary to call and see a river. When the river falls in offsuit 9, and the small blind checks it to us, it's conceivable that the small blind has some funky double gutter that gets there on the river like Queen 10. But this is pretty unlikely given the situation, and most players here would typically bet on the river to make sure that the action doesn't check through. We end up betting 120, targeting bluff catchers such as top pair or even middling 2 pair here. The opponent goes into the tank for a good minute, but unfortunately we don't end up getting any more value for the hand. Nevertheless, we pick up another small pot. We'll be reviewing this next hand from my notes, which happens about an hour after the last hand. A mid-position player opens for 15, and the hijack now 3 bets to 45. We look down at pocket 10s on the button, and find ourselves with our first important decision in this hand. The mid-position player has been playing mostly fit or fold, and hasn't been overly aggressive, while the hijack is a new player who's been overly aggressive, playing probably 75% of his hands, and raising probably 80% of the time since he sat down about half an hour ago. We're not playing extremely deep here against either opponent, so we decide to call here with 10s. The mid-position player also calls, closing the action. We're 3 ways to a king-high flop. When action checks to the hijack, he continues for 45. I think this is a pretty standard continuation bet from this opponent. I make a call here and the other player ends up folding. We're heads up to the turn, which becomes a deuce. This brings a backdoor flush draw into play. The opponent continues here for 100, which might be a sizing tell, as this is not consistent with his previous plays. It's a pretty timid bet and I don't see any other choice but to make another call here. The river brings a 4, which now pairs the board. The opponent now instantly shoves for 400. This board run out doesn't really change a whole lot. If we suspect that we're ahead on the flop, the turn in the river doesn't change anything. Players typically don't try to bluff river board pairs, but this specific player was kinda special. In addition, 400 is pretty much a pot-sized bet here, which again really comes down to tendencies. His line might be credible, but his sizing is all over the place. I take a few moments to assess the situation and decide that this guy deserves all the chips if he has a king. I end up making the call, and the opponent shows ace-queen off, and we scoop this pot. Just a few hands later, we get dealt the same 2 black 10s, and after a mid-position player raises to 15 and the button calls, I raise to 55 in the small blind. The original raiser folds, but the button calls. This player has been at the table for about an hour and has been running hotter than the sun. The flop is queen 8-6, and when I continue here for 45, the button calls pretty quickly. The turn is another queen, and this is where the hand goes off the rails. I check here for some pot control. This opponent is clearly a mind reader, since he now goes all in for 1200. At this point, I'm sort of thinking, but sort of not at the same time. My assessment is that this opponent is purely value betting his own hand strength and simply just lost his mind with the queen. I'm not even contemplating whether this guy has any bluffs, as he's just not capable of having one here. In short, we don't think very long, and we fold. Lugging along here, we find a premium ace-king in mid-position and raise it to 20, and get no less than 3 callers. The flop is 10-8-4 with 2 spades, and action checks all around. The ace of clubs rolls off on the turn, and action checks through again. The river is another 10, and I bet up for 35, looking to get some small value from weaker aces and possibly non-believers. No additional value is to be had, but we're happy taking down a small pot. So there you have it. We had a pretty smooth 2-5 session, which is definitely a good feeling after the last session, where we literally ate it with a 4.3k loss. I'll post a link to it in the description below for those who want to check out what max pain looks like at the table. Also, if you enjoyed this content, consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. It definitely helps with those YouTube algorithms and gives me that motivation to keep churning content out. Lastly, I want to wish everyone happy holidays. It's a happy time for many and a challenging time for some. For the latter, keep on plugging, there's always that silver lining to chase for. In the next episode, I think we'll be checking out Caesar's Palace with some interesting hand histories as well as a few well-timed insane bluffs. As always, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and see you next time.